Let me open by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet today and pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. For those of you who weren't here for the last session, my name's Jane Hall. I'm President-elect of the Academy, and they're sort of not throwing me in at the deep end, they're just breaking me in gently to all the sorts of things that a president has to do. So let me welcome you here to the Cunningham lecture, particularly people who've come particularly for the lecture. May I remind you to just check your phones, please, that they're on silent or turned off. The Cunningham lecture is not just any old lecture, it's the Academy's flagship public lecture. It's named after Dr. Kenneth Stewart Cunningham, who was the first chairman of the Social Science Research Committee, which is the Academy's predecessor organisation. This year's lecture is being delivered by Glenn Withers. Glenn, I think, needs no introduction to any member of the Academy, or indeed to anyone who's been here today, but maybe you don't know quite enough about him. He was the founding CEO of Universities Australia. He's Professor of Public Policy at ANU and the Australia and New Zealand School of Government. He's graduated from Monash and Harvard and held academic posts in various parts of the world, including Harvard and Cambridge. He helped establish the Productivity Commission, the Crawford School, ANZOG, Universities Australia. He's been an advisor to governments, to private sector and community organisations, and his list of accomplishments goes on. He was awarded an Order of Australia for services to applied economics, including for design of the Australian immigration point system. So you can see that Glenn is not just an outstanding scholar, but he's outstanding at taking that scholarship and influencing the public domain. So we're incredibly fortunate to have him, I can't say to have him here because he's the president, he has to be here. We're incredibly fortunate that he's accepted the invitation to give the Cunningham lecture, and it's my pleasure to invite him to the lectern.
Thanks, Jane, for that very kind introduction. For those of you who have been joining us for the Academy Symposium, and indeed some of our meetings yesterday, particularly the presentations from the new fellows last evening, I feel somewhat daunted actually standing here talking to you. It's been delightful insight into some of the best social science, and I'm absolutely so pleased that the Academy has the new fellows that it does with their talents and interests to help us flourish as an Academy. And it's such a pleasure, of course, to be here with colleagues from earlier Academy associations and Canberra linkages. I titled the talk, In Pursuit of Knowledge, Veritas Redux, meaning the hope of revival of commitment to the importance of evidentiary and logical bases for the development of policies, decision-making more generally. Because, of course, currently we have some significant questioning of our roles, and not least in areas like climate change and elsewhere. I was asked to give the talk and came up with that solution by our much-missed colleague, John Beaton. There was, when he asked me to do it, he said some precedent, he said various previous presidents have done so. There was a little glint in his eye that made me hesitate a tiny bit. And I recall for him when I saw this glint, I said, this is reminiscent to me, John. I recall hearing the story of Max Hartwell, an Aussie at Oxford, an economic historian, who was invited back to Australia to give the keynote anniversary address at his rural high school. Max started by saying, when he gave the address, that he was honoured to be invited, but he was surprised they didn't have a more elevated and distinguished speaker than him. at which point the principal was heard to mutter, "Don't think we didn't try, mate." I relayed this to John, who replied impeccably that he couldn't possibly comment. So as Martin Luther might put it, this is a humanities-style insight, you see, so that we show Haas convergent, whatever Simon Birmingham might do with that. Here I stand, I can do no other. And so despite my feeling of inadequacy, I am delighted to be able to talk with you tonight. I was going to be a little bit self-indulgent, and maybe still will be, by talking about some adventures in the getting of wisdom first before I got down to some consequent, I hope, suggestions about the importance of what we do and the way forward with what we do. And let me say, by the way of adventures in the getting of wisdom, that the former Education Minister's intervention, while it's a small part of the big scene in higher education, was a bit disappointing. But when I was at Universities Australia, we knew that each time ARC grants were in fact announced, there was an inevitable ritual whereby the backbenchers who of that inclination would emerge from their caves and bag the esoteric research grant topics. And that was as sure as the sun rises each day. Each year you would go through that ritual. The other ritual, of course, we heard a little about this afternoon, which was whenever Vice-Chancellorial salaries were announced in auditors' general reports in each state and territory, again, the press would automatically go to town on that. It was nice to hear Stephen Parker actually saying that he felt that was partly justified. In that case, there was, I think, less to criticise about the media response, that our Vice-Chancellors, relatively to academic salaries, are amongst the world's leading Vice-Chancellors, if we could put it that way. They were amongst the games that you had to play in our sort of business. But it was disappointing to hear about the secretive vetoes by the Minister. It seems to me, though, when that came out, it was also, I think, the same day as the Credit Suisse mantle was accorded us of the world's highest median wealth per person. And Donald Horne in particular, I think I thought of at the time, because he wouldn't be surprised by this situation. His whole lucky country meme was that we're a country of great people and great achievement with poor, I think he used the word second-rate leadership. And here you had the bagging of insightful humanities research through an impeccable process at the same time as we were being hailed as the world's wealthiest country per person. And that has insights into what is the role of universities and how we approach the circumstances, the context in which we operate in research, and for those of us in research also, as some of our members are outside the university, not quite so much as the Academy of Engineering, for instance, where it has a very distinguished and distinct non-university membership alongside its university scholarly membership. We have a nice leavening of that in the Academy of Social Sciences, and I'm one who would like to see more. But of course our core has to be conventional scholarly excellence, and for those who join us from other vocations, they must share that core in their ways of addressing the world. I mentioned Donald Horne because that issue of the nature of our leadership relative to the achievements of the country stuck in my mind a bit because some years ago I was thinking of the experience of being, for instance, 5 years immersed in some of the world's top scholars at Harvard as a student and staffer. And one of the lessons I came away with from 5 years of immersion was that all the greatest intellects are like real people. They all have huge flaws. And the only one I could never find flaws in was Kenneth Arrow, the economics Nobel Prize winner. I kept looking for something wrong with Kenneth's approach to morality, life, technique and everything else, and I couldn't. But everyone else was wonderful in the sense you came back to Australia quite content that we had people as equal as the world's supposed best, and that those supposed best were themselves as human as you were. And you could conduct a wonderful life of the intellect here in the universities of Australia, which I've always been absolutely convinced was right and is right. But in thinking about these flaws, I was also thinking about Donald Horne, because when he was Australia Council Chair, he commissioned David Throsby, an ASSA fellow, David Throsby and myself, well, it was actually Di Yerbury did the commissioning, to look at the funding of the arts. And we did a report called What Price Culture. And in fact, Horne was a little bit annoyed at the initial commission. And unlike arm's length ABC governance, as we understand it, he was on the phone immediately to Di Yerbury to chastise her for commissioning this work. But when the report came out, because Di backed it fully, it showed that the creative sector was essentially the engine of the new economy, and showed that public opinion, and we used some very early, what would now be called contingent valuation survey methods, to examine how people would say how the government budget should be allocated and why, and to make it add up to what they were willing to pay in their taxes and what types of taxes and so on. It indicated actually very strong support for arts funding in the community. And indeed, I lost money betting David that the western suburbs would say no to opera and ballet, and it would be a North Shore and eastern suburbs phenomenon. I was wrong. David was quite right. And what we found was an immense, what economists call option demand for support for the arts. And it came across in associated focus group work as well as the surveys that people were thinking deeply about these matters, given the appropriately structured nature of the survey and so on, whereby, for instance, they would answer, well, I actually don't like opera and it's all toffee nonsense, but I would like it to be there for my kids if they want to go that way. And this sort of intelligent interrogation was to me a beginning of a notion that we underestimate the standing and understanding of that Australian public, and that Donald Horne was indeed right to put confidence in the average capacities for sensibility and sensible decision-making compared to sometimes what our system, because the leaders of the system are ourselves, writ into those components of the system, what the system has generated is sometimes less than we deserve as citizens of the country. That brings me to the pub test that's been touted recently too in higher education matters, because when you also do this sort of work, as David Throsby and I did, plus subsequently in work for the Australian Council of Learned Academies, and most recently a little bit of like work for the Centre for Policy Development that Terry Moore now chairs, you got similar results to that earlier finding about the arts for a lot of public activities and the role of government. And indeed, for those of you who would like to think where we should be going as a nation, it shows that the potential is there to switch a direction when we have the right leadership, because the people, about 1/3 of the population in these studies consistently says we would like a smaller government, about 1/3 say we'd like a bigger government, and about 1/3 say the present one's about right, or I'd like some more information, please, or I don't know. And it does mean, when you compare those results with a number of other countries, particularly other Anglo-American countries, that we're in a unique position of leadership can significantly influence our direction. That means we're at a sort of switch point. And I think we're at a switch point for other reasons too, which, when you look at our economic and political cycle, we've had in the post-war period a big long boom, the sort of Menzies era boom, and we've had the Hawke, Keating, Howard, Costello long boom. What we had between the Hawke, before the Hawke-Keating period, though, was 10 years of unstable government. It was all those changes from McMahon and Fraser and so on. We're in that similar phase now, maybe for a decade. What we came out of that last decade of introspection and re-examination of our settings and ourselves was, as we began to discuss at various points today, the possibility of a very sensible electorate wanting more from our leaders and the leaders learning that gradually and responding to it. So we are in a position where we could reconstruct our future very constructively if we have an appropriate sense of direction. And now what's that appropriate sense of direction? It's the sort of things that people in this room can provide publicly to government for the considerations and deliberations for those who ultimately make these decisions. And I'll come back to that. When David and I found those results, what was quite interesting though was that Donald Horne then did a U-turn. His speeches for the next 2 years all touted the economic significance of the arts, whereas before he was very much an intrinsic excellence man, and you didn't need these reductionist, economistic arguments. But when it came out in favour, he was a great enthusiast for that approach. And that was in contrast to another experience I had, having worked on some military matters around conscription issues. I went and saw Sir Arthur Tang once and asked him, after I'd looked at the arrangements inside the Department of Defence at the time, with Sir Arthur being just about the last of the great mandarins of that era, there was no economist listed as such anywhere inside the whole of the Department of Defence, which compared to the Americans, and I won't judge how well that worked for the Americans after McNamara, we had no economist position specified. And Sir Arthur said to me when I asked him about this, through an introduction from Trevor Swan, he said, well, actually, I'm an honours graduate in economics from the University of Western Australia. I see everything important myself, and I can apply the lens to it. Besides, once I concede the economics, Treasury have got me. I prefer to parade my generals. This was a very insightful guide to the way in which some bureaucratic politics can be played. But what Sir Arthur might have been pleased with, when you do these contingent valuation surveys, you find that the Australian public back then supported approximately the levels of defence appropriation that were being put in place, and the governments of even today are very much in accord in the defence area more than a number of other areas with public preferences. So that this need to, as it were, separate yourself from the intelligent public is not necessarily quite as required as Sir Arthur assumed. Now, there's lots of other adventures that I'd love to sort of talk about in the getting of wisdom that's going to lead to my conclusions. I've been involved in reflecting on now stepping down as President of the Academy, thinking about things I've been involved in for a while. Over a longish career, and thinking of things ranging from conscription through equal pay, commercial broadcasting policy, public broadcasting policy, LNG exporting, employment programs, immigration, infrastructure finance, childcare policy, education policy, and so on. But equally what I was thinking about from that, which are in a sense ventures in knowledge transmission, how many succeeded and how many didn't, and how you learn lessons from what works and what doesn't. Disappointments in particular quite often are in the middle, where you get cherry picking as a common phenomenon amongst the political class, where, say in a report on childcare to the Howard government, they will pick the private sector recommendations but not act on the support of the community sector recommendations. And you try and dress it up as a package, emphasise it should be adopted as a package, that there will be consequences if you don't, but a number of times I've been through that experience of the cherry picking of recommendations, and more recently too with a report to the Abbott government in employment programs where the same phenomenon was evident. Alongside, and to help avoid that sporadic knowledge effect, where sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, and sometimes you have halfway wins and battles, I tried to get involved, indeed in some ways, and I'm looking at Sir Richardson here, from when way back, she and I were the foundation tutors at La Trobe University in its early days, and I'd been one of the first students at Monash before that. And I enjoyed so much being around in the establishment of a knowledge institution. They were times that were far different to going to an established institution because of the role you played, even as a young tutor. To me, it was an exciting time, and I think I sought to replicate that in a number of areas by helping to try and do things like a Bureau of Labour Market Research and a Bureau of Immigration Research, which didn't be sustainable, but in other things like the Australian-New Zealand School of Government, the Crawford School of Public Policy, if Melinda's still here, the Cedar Council on Economic Policy, or Universities Australia itself. It seemed to me the way to avoid a lot of these itinerant problems of a meretricious player, as John Stone called John Hewson, was to establish institutions whose function was to provide that sort of evidentiary logic and evidence based on good research and analysis as at least a helpful condition for more informed policy formation. And indeed, Val Braithwaite was asking me a few moments ago about lessons from the success of the microeconomic reform era, and it seemed to me that at the Economic Planning Commission that I was at was not a great, sort of headline institution, but what I thought I observed was how, when you got the conflicting interests into a room, gave them an evidentiary basis for their deliberations that constrained the way deliberations would operate, that they muted much of their concerns, got rid of the extraneous and extreme elements and focused on the important differences that remained. It wasn't a vehicle for decision-making, but what you saw was a convergence of policy based on good information, good discussion between previously antagonistic parties. And I guess I just began to realise it's a bit like the Braithwaite's restorative justice principle applied to national policy and not just personal crime type issues. And it seemed to me that in that there was a wonderful basis of the role of good social science helping with good decision making. It can work. The failures, though, did remind me from time to time of some of you may have seen a Thurber cartoon in the New Yorker. There's a guy sitting at a sort of cafe restaurant with a glass of wine or spirits, and he keeps saying that he starts saying, "Look, I'm alone in this world. I keep trying to meet a person that's the one for me. I meet someone I like, and then they reject me and tell me my problems. I try and improve my problems. I try and get over them. I meet somebody else, and then I get rejected. I ask what it was that I did wrong, I'm told, and I improve that and get over that. But then I get rejected again. But I try again, I learn, I improve. I'm beginning to think of myself as the Renaissance man of the rejectees. There's a lot to learn. There's those darned humanities again. What I learned from these endeavours, though, despite the setbacks, is there is a huge constituency for informed policy. Each endeavour had some benefit in policy outcomes, even if it was minimising damage rather than achieving a completely desired result. The perfection in policy that, of course, realpolitik can of course compromise. So I think if we learn the lessons of learning our lessons, then we can continue to keep contributing, as public servants often do. They talk about their bottom drawer, where the things that this minister rejects you put back in the bottom drawer and wait for the next minister and adjust it and try it again and so on, so that ultimately you may have some greater success. It seems to me that the role of researchers and an analyst is to ensure that the best ideas and evidence are at least there for deployment and to keep up the pressure for informed decision making by providing this, so that our role in national efforts and beyond will be maximised, even if it's not the only basis, of course, and never will be, for gaining good outcomes. That's not to decry in any way basic curiosity-driven research. I happen to find pleasure in applied economics and applied public policy analysis, but basic curiosity-driven research is the absolute bedrock that we applied folk draw upon. It's our resource, our wellspring that we need to give us a distinctive edge in entering into these decision makers' domains. I recall, and you don't always win this one either, I recall a vote in the Research School of Social Sciences over a proposal there that was put forward for a Centre for Policy Studies to be established in the research school. Even with the director Max Neutzer behind it, it went down by one vote. And the one vote was that of the truly eminent philosopher Jamie Mackey, who some of you may have heard of, an absolutely world-class top philosopher. And he finished the discussion about the Centre for Policy Studies proposal by saying, "I am going to vote against it. We already have too many lower-order empiricisers in this school." So Max and I shrank. But those were the days when scholarly voice mattered, and the process was absolutely appropriate. That I have a view that the engagement work, the impact work as we're calling it, is the protective belt that gives licence to that speculative and creative dimension of social science investigation, and we need both. For myself, after Universities Australia, and having to be an advocate in that process, though we did adopt the rule of not advocating anything that didn't have a proper evidentiary backing consistent with university principles, but it does mean some areas we didn't say much on, where it went against our interests. But we did support what we did say. I went back to ANU to the Coombs building, and the second day wandered along the top floor corridor where the philosophy department is, where Jamie Mackey was a member. And I was so overjoyed to be back there because along the corridor wandered the sandalled, bearded, wild-eyed gang, replete with bicycle clips and T-shirts, no interest in Parliament House corridors or Chancellery suits, actually avoiding quite often looking you in the eye, but then grabbing you to say, "Hey, you were wrong, you know, on that utilitarian interpretation," and then stagger off again before completing the conversation. But to me, it was a wonderful thing to be back in that type of university environment. It's a world top philosophy department. And my only concern was the loss of an associated phenomenon with that, which is the Coombs Tea Room, which had been where you could engage these sort of folk by just wandering along and joining a table of any good social scientist and working out what they're doing and why and what they think it means. That, under various reforms, cost-saving measures, was defenestrated, and the easy cross-disciplinary learning that we had in the university of that era that I so enjoyed going back to after University of Australia was increasingly diminished. And so you'll begin to see I'm a bit of a concerned person over the managerialism excesses of the modern university. That said, we still do wonderful things, of course. And in the social sciences, you'll remember the volume we produced entitled Social Sciences Shape the Nation. That's free, of course, for download on our website. At the launch, it was impressive how clear the social science contribution was. And if ScoMo really believed the slogan on his hat about making Australia great, the top priority would be the funding of social sciences research, so much more than is the present commitment. The 20% success in, or less success in ARC grants, the limited availability of alternatives to ARC funding for additional support of research, the fact that the direct university grants are not full cost for the research efforts of a university, and so on. What we outlined in that report was how the very foundations of the nation, our economy, our society and environment, the triple bottom line, should recognise what social scientists have given to that. Think, for instance, of how we've been immensely successful in Australia in setting monetary policy well, those 26, 27 years of economic growth have a number of explanations, but one of which is very sensible macro policy setting. Think someone like Adrian Pagan from the ANU. How we have, for all its faults, developed an effective compulsory superannuation scheme that could be improved, but is also far better than is the case for many other countries as a safety net. Think people like Richard Downing from this academy. How well we manage water for enhancing our environment. We don't believe that and understand it in Australia, but a great friend of mine who was the World Bank chief economist for water and water analysis said that we are the world's best practice in this area. We can do a heck of a lot better, but we are world's practice. I think people like Quentin Grafton of this academy. Or look to the social science knowledge contributions, not just to the triple bottom line, but to HEW, health, education and welfare. The development Medibank, think John Deeble. The funding of higher education, think Bruce Chapman. Providing child support through parental payments, think Meredith Edwards of this academy. And what about our foundational institutions that we've been talking about yesterday and today for law and justice? And looking to say native title, think Larissa Behrendt, or equal pay and wage setting, think Sue Richardson. Of urban planning, think of Patrick Troy, the late Patrick Troy. And not to mention our links to the world as a nation through things like immigration points, think Charles Price, APEC, think Peter Drysdale, or trade policy, think Max Corden, one of our recent Jubilee Fellows from the Academy. And think not only of ourselves, but our contributions to the world. Think of plain packaging of cigarettes and the work of someone like Simon Chapman. Think of reintegrative justice and the work of John and Val Braithwaite. And think of things like agricultural export management, go back as far as Sir John Crawford and many others since. Yes, ministers, we can punch above our weight. Perhaps even in climate policy too, if such a policy were allowed. We're used to such lists of research achievement in STEM, but it's important to recognise them in social science too, and HASS generally. And were we to add up their economic significance, this would be an incredibly impressive dollar contribution to the nation, from which in turn some funding for that research emerges. But equally think of matters beyond the felicitous calculus and look at the role of Australian thinkers on a global scale in wider areas, such as think female liberation and Germaine Greer's role, think gay rights and Dennis Altman's role as a fellow of this academy, think animal rights and Peter Singer of this academy's role, think nuclear disarmament, and I'd love to get Helen Caldecott as a fellow of this academy if we can find a way to do that. Our Antipodean perspectives and ideas have had global resonance of fundamental importance. Once again, who said just because you're 1% of the world's population you can't have impact? The naysayers are completely wrong when you have the power of ideas behind you. That such a contribution can occur from great thinking should not be surprising. And the reason's fundamental. It's what we're about, it's what we do. It reflects the fact of why universities have been around enduring for centuries as one of humankind's ongoing creations. It reflects the human thirst for the pursuit of knowledge. This means valuing logic and evidence. That's what's distinct from intuition and impulse, and the knowledge of experience, though that can blend into both. That sort of scientific rationality does not and should not crowd out in any way all our reliances, as we always will have, upon intuition, experience and impulse. But those latter are what we share with the other inhabitants of the earth. What is distinct about the human contribution is the way we have codified and systematically transmitted to ourselves across our species that knowledge that we build from our research insights into education for transmission. That is what universities do, and the engagement process is part of that transmission as well. We research, we educate, we engage. And we do that with transparent and systematic knowledge for our decisions. That is what distinguishes us on this planet from the other creatures of the planet, and why we have develop the position we stand in on the planet. Often we misuse that knowledge and that position, but we have also built a wonderful set of achievements for humankind as a result of that scientific rationality. It can be transmitted and understood by others. Intuitive knowledge can't. You've either got it or you haven't. So it's scientifically rational knowledge which can be systematically tapped, underpins progress despite the missteps, weaknesses and frailties in human endeavour, but it is the fundamental way forward for us to deal with what we would like to conquer by way of enhancing human progress and our enjoyment of this life on Earth. It underpins the progress of our species. Logic and evidence can mightily improve the very fundamental features of this nation and beyond, and help make us even better and solve the problems that continue to be devilish. Currently, I would draw attention to the way in which this knowledge is being shared across the various academies. One of the pleasures of being President of ASSA has been also working with the presidents of the other academies, the 3 others that presently are in place, and also the new Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, headed by Ian Fraser. We meet together regularly and work on projects now through the Australian Council of Learned Academies that, in conjunction with the Chief Scientist, draw on truly interdisciplinary work. We do not do a project in which all academies do not participate, and they participate equally. One academy will manage it, but the intellectual input is equal across the 4 or 5 academies, depending upon the 5th in some particular projects. I'm very enthralled and excited by that Council of Learned Academies, and John Beaton played a huge role this year in being in charge of the executive directors developing a new form of governance for this Council of Learned Academies that has now just been formed. We had a meeting last Thursday, that concluded the new academy arrangements, and it seems like we'll be able to go forward much more strongly on drawing on our strengths in working for government. And I think this is very important because as I stand here and I see people like Mike Keating sitting there, and I talk to people like Ian Watt and hear speeches by people like Peter Shergold, and talk to the new fellow to the Academy, Martin Parkinson, and every one of them has emphasised to me at one stage or another, or said publicly, how much government needs holistic help from the universities and the researchers, how much integration of knowledge, bringing knowledges together rather than glimpses of knowledge, would help in the process of them, of course, fulfilling their functions to integrate things too. But for us to develop a discipline of interdisciplinarity is increasingly an existential challenge for the academies to deliver on. And I think in Australia now, with the Council of Learned Academies, we're moving constructively in that direction. We used to be a National Academies Forum and had very nice interchanges across the academies, but Ian Chubb developing money to throw into a project called the Securing Australia's Future project, transformed, of course, through the incentive of money, dare I say it, or at least funding our goodwill, because we do all the academics put in their money voluntarily, put in their time voluntarily into this, that gave us a whole series of projects from which we learnt. We took too long, we indulged ourselves in too much conceptual argumentation, we had trouble reaching anything near findings and conclusions rather than the process of the investigation. But now with the new Chief Scientist, Alan Finkel, we are being very disciplined. We're producing 6-month reports with findings and working really quickly in a disciplinary manner, and we're consulting much more with government over what topics they would like us to work on. So if you like, it's an interdisciplinary sort of productivity commission exercise, but with informal consultation rather than a formal hearing process. And it seems to be going rather well. Reports on things like precision medicine, energy storage, synthetic biology have been produced, and some reports on Internet of Things and artificial intelligence are underway. Now, this audience will have noticed a certain STEM orientation to those titles. But ASSA Fellows have actually contributed equally to each. And when those contributions are added up, as I've begun to do to try and get a COLA to make this as part of its advocacy, There's a river of gold we are providing to government, free of direct charge, except for the overheads of the academies. And it would be good for us to make that known to government when it's busily charging us for managing HECS fees and other arrangements inside universities. And certainly the total value of that would far exceed the modest grant for the learned academies. I've got to finish up. One contribution, though, that I would point to before I finish up was the first one that John Beaton managed, which was Australia's Comparative Advantage. It was launched at the annual meetings of the Academy 2 years ago by John Hewson. He used multiple research methodologies, but did define many of the elements of a way forward, a narrative for our future. That would now be called probably inclusive growth. There's a group at ANU that have just produced a book edited by Bob Brunig and Mark Fabian. Many fellows of the Academy, such as Andrew Podger, Mike Keating, Peter Whiteford, Bruce Chapman and others have contributed to the book, which develops this notion of inclusive growth into hybrid policy, is the title they use for the volume. And it talks about what we have begun to talk about earlier today, which is the partnership state, how you bring together all the elements of our society, of business, government and community into a cooperative endeavour to enhance our progress and well-being. And those together are in some ways a resource for social sciences to provide that narrative that our leadership needs at the end of this decade of turmoil to take a way forward in the manner that we did with that earlier period of microeconomic reform in the Hawke, Keating, Howard, Costello era. I would mention in passing that in the detailed empirical analysis of the work, it was payoffs in investment in knowledge and in institutional reform, especially federalism, that were the two highest payoff fields when we quantified this work by a consistent modelling methodology as to what would contribute most to our economic future in this case. And we analysed also what this would mean for equity. And again, both of those would be major enhancers of equity and some significant, though not quite as clear-cut, environmental advantages. But the environmental links to this sort of policy were less clear-cut than for equity and economic growth. We also saw, for instance, that within human capital investment, early childhood education, vocational education and training were those that needed most. All higher education and primary and secondary education still had good, healthy payoffs. In finance, Department of Finance terms, they more than exceeded the required social rate of return for investment and were substantially underinvested. But the big payoffs were in early childhood education and in vocational education and training. So if you have a truly limited budget and don't take an investment approach to budget, then those two areas I mentioned were in this report where some of the focus should really be. Higher education also needed improvement of its own, of course, including sums connected with the public purse, restoration of per student, real funding levels, wage indexation for that, 50-50 public-private funding formula, which would bring us closer to OECD norms, and to embed clear guarantees for academic freedom going well beyond the funding area into other matters that unerringly enhance university productivity. We had some lovely research on the way in which academic freedom enhances academic productivity within universities. We'd look for more full-cost funding and education formula. We'd look to supporting the third arm of university responsibility, impact and engagement with appropriate financial supplementary support rather than redirected support, and then link that appropriately, I think, in turn to things like impact funding that might operate through applied research support for TAFEs. Instead of worrying like the Group of Eight does about these parvenus who want to join the research endeavour, wallow in it, love it, have our colleges become applied research colleges, maintain the support for the feeders, the La Trobes and others that are part of what generate the Group of Eight's excellence, and just think where all the vice chancellors in the Group of Eight come from. They were at a Griffith, or they were at a Flinders or whatever. It's part of an ecosystem that we can enhance and sustain and develop, and not retreat and focus on dividing the cake up and diminishing the size of the cake. In doing this, we need to enhance that national interest criteria concern that has reared its head for the award of competitive grants. The present provisions actually severely inhibited the sorts of hugely positive contributions from the social sciences that were outlined earlier in our Social Sciences Shape the Nation study. The national science and research priorities already in place draw on only one dimension of national need, those connected to the natural and physical world. The list is, here are the priorities: food, soil and water, transport, energy, resources, advanced manufacturing, and then finally cybersecurity, health and environmental change. But there's no priorities listed for aged care, banking and finance, religion, terrorism studies, ageing of the population, inequality, immigration, childcare, domestic violence, education, federalism, art and culture, tourism, and the list goes on. That is, the areas in which social sciences has a particular capacity, along with ability to engage these other areas, are not there. The process of review, we are told is in place for those national priorities, really needs widespread consultation. It is derived too much from a so-called horizon scanning that is simply technological projection and doesn't need and doesn't use scenario analysis out of social, economic and political developments. We need both. Both need to be complementary, both need to be supported. And they should be examined in the context not only of what ARC does, but of course ARC and other government research entities, many of which are devoted to those national priorities that were listed, ranging from the Bureau of Meteorology to CSIRO, to Defence Science and Technology, and we'd add in the National Cultural Institutions as well. So that we need that way forward. And we need a wider education review that just doesn't pick a sector at a time, but looks at the whole of post-school education in an integrated way. But that at least seems to be accepted in principle. Such policy refreshment undertaken on a systematic and comprehensive basis could position Australia well to take on and overturn so many of the negatives of this post-truth, alternative fact, fake news era. Contrary to Michael Gove, who infamously indicated he thought for Britain that the country had enough of experts, my own research and experience that I mentioned earlier tells me that Australia not only needs more, but the electorate is thirsting for more and will be very supportive. What's missing is a leadership that understands that. Australians do respond well to their better angels. The work I've been involved in the immigration area always tells me how when leadership emerges, that early enthusiasms for populist approaches to immigration are quickly redressed by all except hardcores on the anti-immigration front and some hardcores on the multicultural front that are also unaffected by evidence, analysis, leadership or anything else. But the great middle is really open for leadership and Australians are willing to be shown the right way forward, to understand it and be with it. So I think we should be working hard to enhance what our universities and research organisations do, recognise we can do more, deploy our talents in the ways we've begun to do through ACOLA and a more outward-looking Academy of Social Sciences as well. We have engaged much more now with parliamentary committees and walking some corridors to try and put some of these messages across. Sometimes I fear we also are bogged down by our sponsors, the universities, that the universities are too managerialist and a complementary role, or if you like, a cross-matrix role from the senior scholars in the academies will be very helpful in ensuring what universities do have that additional scholarly perspective emphasised either as well or sometimes instead of, where the universities are not taking that forward. There's a nice book that this Academy has sponsored that Margaret Thornton, who was here yesterday, I didn't notice Margaret tonight, edited that addresses so many of these issues. And I do note, as evidence, a quick calculation of mine, that only a small share of the Vice-Chancellors and the Deputy Vice-Chancellors across the Australian universities are fellows of any of the academies. But we're delighted, of course, to have as a new fellow tonight Margaret Gardner, and a significant number of Vice-Chancellors who have been deeply involved with this Academy, such as my predecessor, Debbie Terry, people like Keith Hancock, and others. So the academies, I think, can build on the standing of their senior, tenured, emeritus fellows, plus the lovely augmentation of the emerging scholars that we've embraced so enthusiastically in recent years as well. So we can better approach Pascal's objective given to us in 1662, which was thought makes our greatness, thought makes the whole dignity of humankind, I paraphrase a little, therefore work hard to think well. This is the theory of moral sentiments. If we do that, then Veritas Redux in this country and wider is deliverable, as well as very much being a consummation devoutly to be wished. I wish the Academy all strength into these future endeavours. Thank you. Sorry.
That's all right. We're fine, but no time for questions. Glenn, thank you for an erudite, witty and wide-ranging talk. I think what you've given us in the last 50 minutes or so is a map for our journey to wisdom. And I think it's very reassuring to be reminded that the intellectual life that we have here is as vibrant as it is anywhere. To be reminded that social sciences in Australia has made an enormous contribution, not just to Australia, but also to the world. You've reminded us of the importance of research. What you called curiosity-driven, I tend to call basic and applied. And I say that because we applied researchers, we have curiosity too. It's not something that we don't have. I think you've reminded us of the need to learn from rejection and failure, as well as success. And the importance of evidence. Evidence might not always win the day, but it will change the conversation if we can present it in the right way. And finally, of the great need for leadership. And I think that's something that you have characterised and provided to all of the organisations with which you've been associated. So on behalf of the Academy, I would like to thank you very much for your leadership and for your lecture tonight. Thank you very much indeed.